Please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Well, thank you, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to Company. You know, Stephen Sondheim is an extraordinary artist. He was born in 1930 and he died in 2021, sorry. He was 91 years old, and he left the most extraordinary legacy. He won a Grammy, an Oscar, a Tony, an Olivier Award, the Kennedy Center Honors, the Pulitzer Prize, 2 theaters, one in the West End in London and one in New York, are named in his honor. And he really would revolutionize the musical theater. We're not talking about a contributor to the musical theater. We're talking about one of the giants. Remember, he would be very profoundly influenced by Oscar Hammerstein, who would really be his sort of spiritual father and guide who led him into the theater. And in the same way that Rodgers and Hammerstein would dominate the musical theater from the 1940s, literally to the present. Remember, they would give us the Oklahoma formula, how to write a musical, how to present a musical, that we have substantially followed from the 1940s to the present. And in the same way, Stephen Sondheim would do the same thing. And he would transform our theater, and we would start using terms like concept musical, and we were moving in a totally new direction. So let's go back to the beginning here then. So we have Mr. Sondheim being born in 1930 on the Upper West Side of New York. His parents were very upper-class Jewish family. His father created women's clothing. He was a manufacturer. His mother, Foxy, was a clothing designer for women's clothes. They lived at a very fancy address. They lived in the San Remo on the Upper West Side on Central Park West, overlooking the park. As a young boy, Stephen Sondheim took piano lessons, as any self-respecting young man at the time would. And in any case, the family's life would separate. The parents had a very nasty divorce. His father moved across the park to the east side, where he started another family and lived happily ever after. His mother, on the other hand, would spend the rest of her life being very resentful and angry and bitter about the divorce. Actually, when you watch the character Joanne tonight in the story, the older woman, the blonde, who sings the show-stopping number in the second act, Here's to the Ladies Who Lunch, it is really tailored after his mother. His mother was really a piece of work. She was very difficult and very hard on Stephen as a young boy. Actually, in later years, Stephen Sondheim supported his mother, even though he didn't speak to her, because she was having heart surgery, and she wrote him a letter the night before the surgery saying, "The only regret I have in my life is giving birth to you." This does not make her the mother of the year. And keep in mind, you know, when we keep seeing how often characters in Sondheim's shows are disconnected or wounded or emotionally damaged, I think you clearly understand why. And in the same way that Company is going to be a musical about relationships and marriage, and in that story, of course, you understand what made Sondheim so perfect to write it, because he grew up in a family where marriage didn't work, and he had to come to terms in some way, to find a way of having a life and being the person he was. His mother was a social climber, and she met, very prominent people, especially in the musical theater business, and she met the Hammersteins, and Dorothy Hammerstein became a friend of hers. And so the Hammersteins had a home in Doylesville, Pennsylvania. It was sort of a colony where a lot of New York theater artists lived. And so Stephen's mother decided that they had to have a summer home there. And so she bought a home very conveniently that was 3 miles away from the Hammerstein household. She also knew that the Hammersteins had a young son, Jamie, and she was so hoping that her son would be able to move into that family of musical theater royalty, which of course he did. The two young boys went to the same school together. It was called the George School. It's a Quaker school that would very strongly impact Sondheim. Keep in mind, Sondheim was this very lonely, sad, disconnected boy whose father had really sort of abandoned him, whose mother, was out of comic book horrors. And so he would find a family with the Hammersteins. And what would happen is, when Oscar Hammerstein died, Stephen Sondheim gave one of the eulogies, and he said, if Mr. Hammerstein had been a plumber, Stephen Sondheim said, I would have become a plumber. He was such a role model for me. He was a father I never had, and he gave me a sense of family that was so profound. But what, in fact, he gave him was, of course, a phenomenal education in the musical theater. When Stephen Sondheim was in the George School, and he was like 15 years old, he wrote a musical called By George. And, any young artist is full of ego and promise. So Stephen Sondheim thought, when I show this to Oscar Hammerstein, my show is going to be produced on Broadway next year, and I'm going to be the youngest composer, lyricist on Broadway. Well, he gave it to Oscar Hammerstein to read, and the next day, Oscar Hammerstein said to him, please come in and see me and give me your whole afternoon. And when they sat down, he said, well, son, I have to tell you, this is the worst musical I've ever read. So it stopped his dreams of being on Broadway the next season. But Oscar Hammerstein gave him a sort of formula to follow, which Stephen Sondheim did, and it took him almost 10 years to complete the assignment. What Oscar Hammerstein said to him was, pick a play that you think is perfect to be translated as a musical and create a musical. Second of all, pick another play that has flaws, but you think you can fix and turn it into a musical. The third play is to pick a story that is not a play, so novel, film script, newspaper article, and that will be your third musical. In fact, an interesting footnote about this assignment, Stephen Sondheim took the story, the novel, of Mary Poppins to translate, and he got sort of 2/3 of the way through it and could never complete it. Would have been a totally different Mary Poppins, that's for sure. And then fourth of all, he said, pick an original idea and develop it as a musical. Stephen Sondheim would take that very seriously, and for the next 10 years, he would try to do what his mentor had told him to do. He would go to Williams College, where there was an extraordinary music faculty, and he was taught a great deal about composition. As you know, when we think about Stephen Sondheim's musicals, they are very complicated. They're not, oh, what a lovely morning, and oh, what a beautiful day, and they're not the simple songs we're accustomed to hearing in Broadway musicals. The melodic lines are very sophisticated, very complicated, very complex. Anyone who works in the musical theater will always tell you it's a vocal exercise to be in a Sondheim musical. The work is so rangy, the music is so sophisticated and tricky, and the key changes are so complex and testing and demanding. So he would bring to it a whole new way of perceiving music. But the important point I want to make for you is, as an artist, anyone aspiring to be in any art form has to understand the form before he's able to move in a new direction or create a new kind of theater, in this case, musical theater. So in the case of Sondheim, this is how how his career would fall. Very early on, again, Oscar Hammerstein, as the mentor, would call Stephen and say, I have the opportunity for you to write the lyrics for your first Broadway musical, West Side Story. And he was going to be working with Leonard Bernstein and Arthur Lawrence and Hal Prince. I mean, it was an extraordinary group of people that were involved in this project. And so, you know, his birth into the musical theater really was royal. I mean, any other person aspiring, any other young composer aspiring to work in the musical theater would not have the entree that Stephen Sondheim did. So we're ready then for the next musical to come along, and Ethel Merman was preparing a show about vaudeville and about the life of Gypsy Rose Lee, and so again, Stephen Sondheim said, I'll only do this show if I can write both the music and the lyrics. And he met with Ethel Merman and made that proclamation. And she said, listen, Sonny, I just got burned by a composer who didn't know what he was doing. I'm going to pick Julie Stein. If you want to do the lyrics, you can do that. And he smartly did. And so he would have these two great hits very early on, but as only a lyricist, not as a composer. So at this point, he went back to his mentor and said, my aim is really to be, I want to compose music. And so he was finally given a wonderful break again because of the contacts with his mentor, and he was able to do a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, and which of course was this musical about Greek and Roman comedies, and it had a great deal of trouble when it was on the road. No one could figure out what the show was about. Keep in mind, we always talk about the idea that the opening number in a show is always the I want number, when a character tells the audience what he wants, and that's what the rest of the musical is going to be about, achieving that goal. But Stephen Sondheim broke that rule when the show was in such trouble, and people kept saying, we don't know what this show is about. We can't put it together. And so he wrote an opening number that was called Comedy Tonight. So instead of it being a number saying, this is what I want in the show, he basically said to the audience, this is what the show is about. Listen very carefully to the opening music in Company. It does the same thing. It tells you what the story is going to be about. So he had these three great hits now. And I mean, he's a young artist at the top of his game. He would then have two failures. He would do I Hear a Waltz with Angela Lansbury. Her first show on Broadway was a catastrophe. It ran 16 performances. And then Richard Rodgers was doing a musical called Do I Hear a Waltz? And Oscar Hammerstein had died, so there was a lot of pressure on Stephen Sondheim to write the lyrics for that, which he did, and it was only lukewarm successful. So here he is. I mean, I just want you to be aware that, you know, many times artists start and they get rave reviews for a show. Think of John Michael Tebelak and Godspell. I mean, you know, it was a rave review everywhere in the world, and he was the ultimate celebrity in the musical theater, but he was never able to come up with another musical. And this happens. The next show he did was a failure, and then that sort of wiped him out, both emotionally, spiritually, and artistically. So here is Stephen Sondheim at this very difficult period, when a young aspiring artist could very quickly be forgotten. Things turn over very quickly in any art form. But Stephen Sondheim would do something that would transform his career and really turn him in to the Rodgers and Hammerstein of the 1970s. He would write the musical Company, and it would transform the musical theater. Suddenly, we were going to use words like concept musical. It did not follow the formula of a well-developed story with a beginning, middle, and end. In the case of Company, it's a series of vignettes. And when you see the opening moment in Company, it's a birthday party. And it's the 35th birthday for Bobbie, and he's being surrounded by 5 couples who are his dearest friends. That's in the original version of the show. You're going to see a totally different version of the show, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in any case, Company then, from the very beginning, from the very opening number, when we have the birthday, and we meet all of these 5 couples and Bobbie, that we realize that it's going to be a very unusual show. The story is going to be told through a series of vignettes rather than well-constructed storyline. And so we go to one couple and their apartment, we go to another couple and we see a scene on their terrace, we go to another couple where they're on the stoop smoking grass, and so there's a whole range of vignettes that we see that seem to be disconnected. What connects them, of course, is the character Bobbie. Let me tell you how this happened. Stephen Sondheim was desperate to reinvent himself at this period. He established a relationship with Hal Prince. And as you remember, Hal Prince was one of our greatest producers, one of our greatest directors. Hal Prince worked with all of the great artists of the day, Lenny Bernstein, Rodgers and Hammerstein. He worked with everyone. He did Phantom of the Opera. And so, you know, he was the perfect person to have a relationship with Stephen Sondheim. Sondheim knew he wanted to move away from the formula of the Rodgers and Hammerstein, Oklahoma format of how to do a musical. And I mean, even though he is trained by his mentor, I mean, any great mentor would always say to their student, move beyond me, go in a different direction. And this is when Stephen Sondheim really found his voice with Company. And how it happened, Hal Prince said to him, I want you to read some plays that George Furth has written. George Furth was a very popular sort of comic playwright at the time, and he had written a story about 5 couples living in Los Angeles, and they were a series of one-act plays. And he had written them for Kim Stanley, the great actress, and Anthony Perkins, the great artist, was going to direct it. And so they gave it to Hal Prince to read just to get his opinion, and he gave it to Stephen Sondheim, and he said, why don't you read it, tell me what you think about these plays. So Sondheim read it and said, I think this would be the basis of a brilliant musical, but we should change the locale from Los Angeles to New York, and we should invent a new character that connects all these little vignettes that we see of 5 couples living different lives in a big city. And so he said, let's invent the character Bobbie, and let's make it his 35th birthday, and let's make this a musical about marriage and relationships. Now, remember, in the 1970s, I mean, you know, this is perfect. This is a period of the Vietnam War. This is a period of sexual freedom. This is a period of analysis. This is when everyone is reading Portnoy's Complaint and everyone is seeing the movie The Graduate. It's a very hip time, and it's a period where the old values of the 50s are being reevaluated. And what better place to do that in a thriving metropolis like New York? And who knows New York better than Stephen Sondheim, who had spent his entire life within a very few blocks of that city. Very rarefied blocks, I might add, but nevertheless. So in any case, he sets off then to write this musical, and Hal Prince becomes the perfect person to collaborate with him, because Hal Prince has all of these visual gifts, and he has the ability of taking disconnected things and making them work powerfully on the stage. So one of the first things they did in this production was they created a set design for it that was all done out of scaffolding, and there were elevators. You're not going to see any of that in the production you see, but that's how it was done in the 1970s, and it became the perfect metaphor for New York City and the isolation of people living in various parts, of this scaffolding. And it became, it was, when I saw Company, I mean, it was so, I was a young artist starting in the theater, but it was so mind-blowing because it was so unlike anything we had seen in the musical. You've now seen hundreds of musicals that have been very strongly influenced by Company and that kind of abstraction and staging and not having to have a show that has a clear beginning, development, middle, end. In this case, what we have is a story where we keep going back and seeing the same birthday party, but we keep seeing it in a different way. In a way, this is a very sort of expressionistic version where we're really seeing the world through Bobbie's eyes. And the music that Sondheim would write is extraordinary. I mean, when you watch the show, a song like Another 100 People Just Got Off of the Train, it's about everyone moving into New York and the frenzy of New York and the pressured humanity of New York, and yet the notion that even though you're in one of the most densely populated areas on the planet, you can feel tremendous isolation and feel very alone. New York becomes the perfect metaphor for the story. And so Sondheim then brings these characters to life in such a vivid way, and we're so involved with these characters, and especially with Bobbie, who can't make a commitment. Keep in mind, originally they wanted Anthony Perkins to play this role. And he turned it down. I mean, he was a great actor, as you remember, but he turned it down saying, I have no idea how to play Bobbie, because Bobbie is only reacting. He never makes decisions. He's very inactive. Everyone inflicts things on him. Everyone tells him what to do. Bobbie, are you coming for dinner? I mean, listen to all those driving lyrics that happen. And so Anthony Perkins said, the character is really like Hamlet, in that Hamlet, the whole story of Hamlet is Hamlet's inability to make a decision. In the story Hamlet, the decision is, should I kill the king? And then, of course, he does. But it takes a long time and a long period of inaction, and that's not how theater is built. Theater is built on action. So Anthony Perkins turned that role down, but he hit a very important point in that role. Watch in this version of the show how successful the Bobbie, this time female, B-O-B-B-I instead of B-O-B-B-Y, in this sort of female version where the central figure is Bobbie, a woman celebrating her 35th birthday, and it brings about much more urgency. It's so interesting when the director of this version of the show that you're going to see wrote to Stephen Sondheim. So many people had made so many ideas about how to do company. They wanted to do a gay version of it at one point, a whole wide variety of ideas, and Sondheim turned everything down. But when Marianne Elliott, who is in my mind one of the greatest directors of the day, wrote to him and said, I hope you're sitting down because I want to do a version of Company where Bobbie is a woman. And Stephen Sondheim wrote back to her and said, I hope you're sitting down. The answer is yes. And so therefore we would have this extraordinary work. Okay, but let me just go back then for a moment to the original version. So I can't stress strongly enough for you how this version of the show would totally change our idea of how musicals should be staged, what they should be about, how they should be developed. I mean, keep in mind, in the old Rodgers and Hammerstein formula, you always had to have a character sing, telling you what the character wanted, and it had to make a very strong statement about moving the story forward. In the case of Company, that isn't what happens. I mean, watch, deep in the show when the female Bobbie is having a relationship with a male flight attendant, and the song is Barcelona, and the song is about the fact that two lovers who have spent the night together have to separate because he's going off to Barcelona on an early morning flight. And that really has nothing to do with character or character development, but it's such a beguiling song and it works so brilliantly. The other thing I want you to remember, I mean, all of Sondheim's life, from the time he was a very young boy, he was very interested in language. And in a way, he really isn't only a lyricist. He's really a poet, a philosopher. His use of language, listen carefully to phrases in the music. It's really extraordinary. You know, when you really want to understand Bobbie, and especially in this version of the show, be very conscious of all of Bobbie's solos, because each of those solos give you such dimension in terms of understanding who Bobbie is, which will explain her inability to make decisions. And of course, the great number in the show is being alive. The number being alone is not being alive. And the wonderful phrases and ideas that pull you so strongly into the story. And the language is so facile. It goes so quickly. I mean, you know, he's living in, Sondheim is living in the tradition of Cole Porter and Noel Coward in his ability to use language in such an elegant and special way, and yet to reveal so much about what happens. Company is a very funny musical. You will hear the audience, which we rarely hear happen, really laugh out loud with big belly laughs all through the show. But then at the same point, he's able to turn it very quickly and make a very poignant moment or make a very touching moment. And he does this in the lyrics and in the music and in the phrasing. It's an extraordinary work. Okay, so in the same way that Oklahoma would transform the musical in the 1940, in the same way Company in 1970 would do the same thing. Remember, Sondheim would then go on in that decade with Hal Prince to give us some of the greatest musicals that we have. I mean, we have Follies, A Little Night Music, Pacific Overtures, Sweeney Todd, and that whole period would end with Merrily We Roll Along. When that show happened, Merrily We Roll Along, after the critics had raved about Sondheim and Hal Prince for 10 years, saying they were the high priests of the musical theater, and they were, they hated Merrily We Roll Along, and they ripped it to pieces. It was a show that played 22 performances on Broadway. I saw 16 of them. I was a young artist working in the theater, and it's a musical. It's Stephen Sondheim's most autobiographical musical. Incidentally, it's playing in New York right now. It's had, for a flop in New York, it's had more revivals in New York than any other show I can think of. So the critics were wrong, and the music is spectacular. And it basically, in a very autobiographical way, is a story of three young artists trying to make their way in the theater. The story is told backwards, so you start with the three people being very successful, and we move back to the beginning when they were very young and struggling. And it really is a story of Stephen Sondheim, Hal Prince, and Mary Rogers, who was the daughter of Richard Rogers. And they were the sort of great team together and very profound friends as they would all find their way to life in the theater. Again, as I'm telling you, right now it's playing in New York. It's one of the hardest tickets to get in New York right now. But if you are in New York, in the next brief period of time, I really recommend that you see Merrily We Roll Along. So he left this great legacy, but because the critics so assaulted him, he then was going to leave the musical theater, and he started to write murder mysteries with George Furth, actually, which was not very successful. He then would go on, have a new relationship with another great artist, James Lapine, and he would move off Broadway, where he would have the great successes with Sunday in the Park with George, Into the Woods, Passion. So an extraordinary career. Okay, so now we have our modern version of Company. Marianne Elliott is, as I told you, my favorite female director, certainly. She had a long career in London in regional theaters and in very experimental theaters like the Royal Court. I watched her work for years, but her great great triumphs would come when she moved to the National Theater and she directed War Horse, a show you've seen, and The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which you've also seen, which are two of our greatest productions in the last 25 years. She would go on to do very experimental work. She would do a black version of Death of a Salesman that was enormously successful. And then she came upon Company. And again, the choice is made to have a female Bobbie. It works brilliantly. Very little changes have been made, a few pronouns here and there, but that's it. But the other thing that Marianne Elliott did was, I mean, it's very hard to move away from that original vision that Hal Prince had of the scaffolding and the sort of power of the city looming over these people and their little lives. She will treat this in a very different way. Watch all of the visuals. But the other thing to watch very carefully is how she's able to link songs and scenes in a very curious way. One of the things she does in the relationships of couples, she invents a gay couple. And so instead of Amy singing, "I'm not getting married today," which is probably the greatest patter song ever written, it's done by a man named Jamie. And it's in this gay relationship, and it's enormously funny and plays beautifully. The actor who did it in New York would win a Tony Award, rightfully so, for an outstanding performance. And then the other thing Marianne Elliott has done, if you know the show very well, for example, watch the scene where they're smoking dope. She inverts the role. So the actor plays the female role and the actress plays the male role. But it's sort of the inversion of couples now, the powerful woman working and the husband being an at-home father, et cetera. So all of this works brilliantly, and it brings out the power of the material, and it takes away the idea that this is a dated 1970s show, and it brings it right to today, and it makes it so pertinent and powerful, and we're dazzled by the music. So please enjoy Company. Thank you.